The month following the wedding moved with the agonizing, suffocating slowness of a creeping lava flow. High summer had descended upon the Caldera Palace, bringing with it a thick, oppressive humidity that settled over the obsidian courtyards and gilded rooftops like a wet woolen blanket. For 30 days, Aang and Azula had existed in a fragile, meticulously orchestrated isolation. Their sprawling private wing had become a fortress, heavily guarded by Zuko's most trusted men. Within those walls, they danced a quiet, terrifyingly polite waltz around one another, their entire existence orbiting the 6-month-old boy who held the fate of the world in his chubby, uncoordinated hands. Today, however, the fortress walls were about to be breached. It was the morning of the Global Diplomatic Summit. The world could no longer ignore the shifting tectonic plates of power. The Avatar, the ultimate symbol of global neutrality and balance, was now legally and permanently bound to the Dragon Dynasty. The other nations were terrified, and they had come to the Fire Nation capital to assess the threat. Inside the royal bedchamber, the tension was thick enough to crack stone. Before the heavy bronze doors of the Great Hall were to be thrown open to the world leaders, Zuko slipped into the private wing. The young Fire Lord looked utterly exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his golden eyes, and the heavy, intricate crown of his station seemed to press his shoulders down toward the floor. He had spent the last 48 hours running damage control with his own sages and preparing for the onslaught of foreign dignitaries. But the moment Zuko stepped past the velvet drapes and saw his nephew, the crushing mantle of the Fire Lord vanished entirely. Zahn was currently sitting in the exact center of the thick, fire-resistant rug. At 6 months old, he had recently mastered the art of sitting up without the massive mountain of silk pillows supporting him, though the mastery was tenuous at best. He sat with his legs splayed wide, wobbling precariously like a top running out of momentum, his bright gray eyes wide and intensely focused on a wooden turtle duck toy in his hands. Zuko let out a long, heavy exhale that sounded like a prayer of relief. He didn't hesitate. Disregarding his pristine, ceremonial crimson robes, the Fire Lord dropped heavily to his knees on the rug. "Who's getting so big?" Zuko murmured, his scarred face breaking into a wide, impossibly gentle smile. Zahn looked up, dropping the wooden toy. He blinked at the newcomer, his little brow furrowing for a fraction of a second before recognition set in. He let out a loud, bubbly shriek of pure delight. Zuko lifted his wide, flowing royal sleeves, hiding his face completely from the baby's view. "Where did Uncle go?" Zuko whispered. Zahn leaned forward, wobbling dangerously, his eyes wide with 6-month-old suspense. Zuko dropped the sleeves abruptly. "Here he is," Zahn gasped, throwing his head back and unleashing a belly laugh so forceful it nearly sent him toppling backward. Zuko caught him effortlessly by the waist, steadying him. Zahn clapped his hands together, reaching out with newfound coordination to grab at the shiny, jagged golden points of Zuko's royal headpiece. "Ah, no, that's sharp, little spark," Zuko said warmly, gently deflecting the baby's grasping hands. Instead, Zuko offered his index fingers. Zahn seized them immediately with a surprisingly strong grip. Within seconds, the baby was trying to drag Zuko's thumb directly into his mouth to soothe his aching, teething gums. Zuko didn't pull away, he just laughed softly, completely unbothered by the drool coating his royal hands. Sitting at her ornate vanity a few feet away, Azula watched them. She was already dressed in her formal armor, the terrifying, heavy obsidian and gold plating she had worn on her wedding day. It was a psychological weapon, and today, she intended to wield it. Aang stood near the balcony doors, adjusting the heavy crimson sash over his saffron robes. He watched Zuko with a soft, grateful smile. But as the distant, echoing sound of a massive gong resonated through the palace walls, signaling the gathering of the council, the warmth drained from the room. Zuko reluctantly gently pulled his hands free from Zahn's grip. He stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from his robes, his jaw locking back into the rigid lines of a wartime ruler. "The Earth King brought a small army of Dai Li as an honor guard," Zuko reported, his voice dropping into a harsh, stressed cadence. He looked at Aang, then at his sister. "The Northern Water Tribe delegation looks ready to declare a naval blockade if things go south today. They are terrified of you too." "I'm not a threat to them, Zuko," Aang said, stepping forward. He reached down and scooped Zahn up from the rug, supporting the baby's back as Zahn immediately began to babble, entirely oblivious to the geopolitical crisis. "I'm just trying to be a father." "They don't see a father, Aang," Zuko said grimly. "They see the Avatar, the most powerful being on the planet, legally bound to the Dragon Dynasty. Kuei thinks Azula has you held hostage. The North thinks she has poisoned your mind. They think the Fire Nation has claimed the Avatar as a weapon of state. Let them think what they will, Azula said. Her voice was like cracking ice. She stood up, her armor clinking sharply in the quiet room. She walked over to them, her golden eyes burning with absolute, lethal intent. If they try to separate us, or attempt to dictate the terms of our son's life, they will find the caldera far less hospitable than they remember. Are you prepared to face them, Avatar? Because they will not attack us directly. They will look for the weakest link. Aang adjusted his grip on Zahn, securing the baby against his chest. His gray eyes hardened, stripping away the soft, playful monk and revealing the ancient, unyielding spirit beneath. I'm ready. We walk in together. Before the suffocating, formal proceedings were to begin, Aang needed to breathe. The air in the private wing had become too thick with anxiety. He carried Zahn out into the secluded garden corridors, a labyrinth of high stone walls, winding pathways, and exotic, blooming fire lilies. The heat was oppressive. Zahn, dressed in lightweight, pale crimson linen, was fussing slightly, his face flushed from the humidity. The baby squirmed in Aang's arms, letting out short, irritated whining sounds. I know, buddy, it's hot, Aang murmured. He shifted Zahn to sit securely on his hip. Taking a deep breath, Aang pursed his lips and blew a continuous, hyper-focused, gentle stream of cool air directly over the baby's flushed face. The effect was instantaneous. Zahn stopped whining, his eyes widening as the cool breeze ruffled his dark hair. Intrigued, the 6-month-old opened his mouth wide, turning his head side to side, actively trying to eat the wind. Aang smiled, a genuine, blinding expression of love, adjusting the airflow to tickle Zahn's nose, making the baby sneeze. It's good to see you smiling, Aang. I was beginning to worry you had forgotten how. Aang turned. Standing at the end of the stone archway was Hakoda. The chief of the Southern Water Tribe wore his formal, heavy blue and white robes, looking entirely out of place in the tropical heat of the Fire Nation. He didn't look furious, but the lines around his eyes were carved deep with exhaustion and a profound, heavy concern. Hakoda, Aang greeted, his posture straightening instantly. He offered a respectful, one-handed bow. Hakoda closed the distance between them. He reached out, his calloused hand resting heavily on Aang's shoulder. He looked down at Zahn, who was still trying to catch the lingering cool air with his hands. Hakoda's eyes softened momentarily at the sight of the child, but when he looked back up at Aang, his blue eyes were piercing. I promised Katara I would find you before the summit began, Hakoda said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried the weight of a world on edge. I told her I would look you in the eye and make sure you aren't a prisoner here. The Earth King thinks she has a knife to your back. The North thinks she has poisoned your mind with blood magic. Are you safe, Aang? Aang bounced Zahn gently on his hip, feeling the solid, comforting weight of his son. I'm safe, Hakoda. They don't understand. She's his mother. I'm not a hostage. They understand perfectly well who she is, Hakoda sighed, his hand falling from Aang's shoulder. He looked around the pristine, terrifyingly beautiful gardens of their former enemy. They understand that she is the woman who conquered Ba Sing Se, struck you down with lightning, and nearly burned the Earth Kingdom to ash. You are the Avatar, Aang. You belong to the world. But you have chained yourself to its greatest threat. I haven't forgotten my duties to the world, Aang defended firmly. But Zahn is my duty too. The Council will try to separate you from her today, Hakoda warned, his tone dropping to a grim whisper. They will try to find a legal or political loophole to extract you and the boy from the caldera. They will paint her as a monster unfit to raise the Avatar's heir. Be careful, son. Do not let your heart blind you to the political reality of the wolves you are sitting with. Aang looked down at Zahn, tracing the soft curve of the baby's cheek. I know exactly who I'm sitting with, Hakoda. And they are about to find out exactly who I am. The Grand Council chamber was a masterpiece of architectural intimidation. The ceiling soared 50 feet high, painted with twisting, golden dragons. Massive braziers roared with eternal flames, casting long, dancing shadows across the polished black marble floor. At the head of the room, Zuko sat upon the elevated, imposing dragon throne. Below him, seated in a wide semicircle, were the world leaders, King Kuei of the Earth Kingdom, Chief Arnook of the Northern Water Tribe, and Hakoda. Each was flanked by their elite guards. To the right of the throne, sitting at a long, dark mahogany table, were Aang and Azula. They were a jarring, terrifying contrast. Azula sat perfectly rigid in her heavy armor, her golden eyes sweeping over the dignitaries with a predatory, unblinking stillness. Beside her, Aang wore his saffron robes. He was not seated in a meditative posture. He had strapped a simple, woven nomad sling to his chest, and Zahn was secured firmly against his heart. Aang refused to let the boy out of his sight, his arms resting protectively around the baby. The summit had been going in circles for 2 hours. Diplomatic pleasantries had worn thin, replaced by passive-aggressive posturing and thinly veiled accusations regarding the Avatar's neutrality. King Kui, emboldened by the silent, imposing presence of his Dai Li guards, finally pushed the issue over the edge. Avatar, Kui began, adjusting his round glasses, his voice trembling slightly but attempting to project authority. We must address the elephant koi in the room. The world rejoices at the continuation of the air nomad line. Truly, it is a miracle. But, the geopolitical reality of the situation cannot be ignored. Aang's jaw tightened. Speak plainly, King Kui. The child is the Avatar's heir, Kui said, standing up, gesturing nervously toward Aang's chest. He is a symbol of global balance. Yet, he is currently residing in the very heart of the Fire Nation, being raised under the volatile and historically destructive influence of Princess Azula. Azula did not move, she did not even blink. But the temperature in her immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. We suggest, Kui continued, swallowing hard, that for the safety and absolute neutrality of the child, the boy should be relocated. Ba Sing Se offers unparalleled protection in a neutral ground. We propose that the Avatar's heir be raised in the Earth Kingdom, away from the corrupting influence of the caldera. Silence slammed into the massive chamber. It was a direct, breathtakingly audacious threat. Kui was suggesting state-sponsored kidnapping, wrapped in the guise of global security. Aang's gray eyes flared. He didn't move. He didn't enter the Avatar state. The glowing arrows did not illuminate. But Aang's maternal, lethal instinct, the instinct of a father whose child had just been threatened by an army, snapped. Without a single physical gesture, Aang pulled the air. Instantly, the atmosphere in the massive chamber became incredibly, impossibly thin. The heavy, roaring flames in the braziers sputtered and shrank, starved of oxygen. The massive silken tapestries hanging from the walls froze in place. King Kui gasped, his hands flying to his throat, his eyes going wide with sudden panic. Beside him, Chief Arnook and Hakoda gripped the edges of their tables, their chests heaving as their lungs frantically searched for air that was no longer there. Even the Dai Li guards staggered, their stoic facades crumbling as they choked on the sudden vacuum. Aang stared at Kui, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm, while the Earth King began to turn a pale shade of blue. Before Aang could do something irreversible, before he could permanently cross the line from protector to tyrant, he felt a sharp, heavy pressure on his left forearm. Azula stood up. She placed her gauntleted hand firmly over Aang's arm. It was a grounding touch, a physical anchor that snapped Aang out of the blinding, lethal haze. He blinked, and the air rushed back into the room with a deafening whoosh. The braziers roared back to life. The dignitaries collapsed against their chairs, gasping and coughing violently, clutching their chests in terror. Azula stepped forward, moving away from the table, placing herself between the gasping world leaders and her husband and child. You speak of corruption, King Kui, Azula said, her voice dropping to a silken, venomous whisper that carried effortlessly across the echoing chamber. She looked down at the coughing Earth King with absolute, unadulterated disgust. Yet, you sit in my nation, in my brother's palace, and you suggest kidnapping a 6-month-old infant from his mother's arms to hold as a political hostage in your dirt city. Kui wheezed, shrinking back into his chair. Princess, it is a matter of global security. The boy's volatile nature, it is a matter of my blood, Azula interrupted, her voice cracking like a whip. She took another step forward, her golden eyes burning with a lethal fire that made the Dai Li guards instinctively step back. You think because I am married to a monk, I have lost my teeth. You think I will allow bureaucrats to dictate the terms of my son's existence. She swept her gaze across the room, ensuring every leader met her eye. Threaten my family again, Kui, Azula promised, her tone entirely devoid of bluff, and the Avatar's wind will not be the only thing that suffocates your city. I will personally reduce the upper ring to glass. We are bound by Agni and the spirits. Question the Avatar's judgment, you answer to me. Am I understood? Kui, still trembling from the near asphyxiation, nodded frantically. The other leaders remained silent, entirely cowed by the terrifying, flawless synergy they had just witnessed. They had come to separate the Avatar from the princess. Instead, they had discovered that attacking one meant facing the unrestrained, lethal wrath of both. When the heavy oak doors of their private wing finally slammed shut and the locking bar fell into place with a resounding thud, the adrenaline of the summit vanished, leaving a heavy, exhausted wreckage in its wake. The political theater was over, but the toll it had taken on their nerves was immense. Zahn was highly unsettled. Babies were incredibly perceptive to the emotional states of their parents, and the 6-month-old had absorbed the sheer, suffocating tension of the council chamber. The moment they were alone, Zahn completely melted down. He was squirming aggressively against Aang's chest in the sling, letting out a sharp, continuous, frustrated wail. His little face was red, tears streaming down his chubby cheeks. Aang hastily unfastened the sling, pulling the crying infant out and holding him against his shoulder. "Shish, it's okay, Zahn. We're home, we're safe," Aang murmured, his voice a soothing, low rumble. He began his usual, steady pacing across the room, rocking his body back and forth. But Zahn refused to settle. The baby arched his back, kicking his legs furiously against Aang's stomach. With his newly developed coordination, Zahn reached up blindly in his distress. His tiny, surprisingly sharp fingernails caught the skin of Aang's cheek, dragging down and leaving a faint, red scratch. In the next breath, Zahn's little fist closed tightly around Aang's left earlobe, pulling hard with an angry, distressed shriek. Sitting at her ornate vanity across the room, mechanically removing the heavy gold pins from her headpiece, Azula watched them in the mirror. Her muscles tensed. She waited for the inevitable. She was a product of the Fire Nation royal house. She was raised by Ozai. In Azula's worldview, children were expected to be seen and not heard. They were extensions of royal authority, and any display of emotional volatility or physical disrespect was met with swift, uncompromising discipline. If she had ever struck her father, even as an infant, Ozai would have backhanded her or handed her off to a wet nurse in absolute disgust, demanding the weakness be purged. She watched Aang's reflection, expecting the Avatar to lose his temper. She expected him to yell, or to forcefully pry the baby's hands away and place him in the bassinet to cry it out. She expected him to demand she take over. Instead, Aang stopped pacing. He winced slightly at the sharp pull on his ear, but his expression did not harden. It softened into something impossibly, devastatingly warm. "Ouch," Aang whispered softly, a tired but entirely genuine smile touching his lips. Moving with infinite, deliberate gentleness, Aang reached up. He didn't smack Zahn's hand away. He gently, patiently untangled Zahn's tiny fingers from his earlobe. Once he had the baby's hand free, Aang brought the small, balled-up fist to his mouth and pressed a tender, lingering kiss against Zahn's palm. "I know you're upset," Aang murmured, pulling the crying baby back against his chest, tucking Zahn's head beneath his chin to make him feel secure. He resumed his swaying, his voice dropping into a deep, rhythmic air nomad hum that vibrated through his chest cavity. It was loud, and there were too many people, and you're tired. "I know, my little windstorm. I've got you. You're allowed to be mad. I've got you." Azula's hands froze halfway to her hair. She stared at the mirror, completely taken aback. Aang was bleeding slightly from the scratch on his cheek, yet he held the child tighter. He wasn't angry. He wasn't demanding respect. He was simply absorbing his son's distress, offering nothing but unconditional, boundless patience. It was an active disruption of her entire worldview. Ozai demanded a perfect, silent, flawless heir. Aang only demanded that his son felt safe. The concept of this gentle fatherhood, a power that did not rely on fear or absolute control, was so alien to Azula that it made her chest physically ache. She couldn't comprehend it. It made her feel entirely unmoored, as if the ground beneath the caldera had suddenly turned to ash. It took nearly an hour, but Aang's relentless patience finally won out. The pacing and the deep, resonant humming soothed Zahn's fractured nerves. The baby's cries dissolved into soft, jerky hiccups, and finally, the heavy, even breathing of deep sleep. Aang walked slowly to the pristine royal bassinet. He laid Zahn down with agonizing care, pulling the soft, flame-retardant blanket over the baby's chest. He stood over the bassinet for a long moment, ensuring Zahn was completely under. Then, Aang stepped back. The adrenaline that had kept him upright all day finally abandoned him. Aang slumped to the floor, right there beside the bassinet. He pulled his knees up to his chest, resting his forehead against his crossed arms. In the dim light of the bedchamber, He didn't look like the triumphant avatar who had just cowed the world leaders. He looked incredibly young, incredibly small, and deeply, deeply traumatized. Azula turned on her velvet stool, facing him directly. The heavy silence of the room stretched between them, thick with the unsaid horrors of the council chamber. "Are you injured?" Azula asked, her voice quiet, cutting through the silence. Aang shook his head without looking up. "No." "Then why are you sitting on the floor looking like you've just lost a war?" she demanded, though her tone lacked its usual bite. Aang slowly lifted his head. His gray eyes were dark, haunted by shadows she had never seen in him before. He looked at her, the mask of the peaceful monk completely shattered. When King Kui suggested taking him, Aang said, his voice hollow, a rasping whisper that barely reached her. When he said the words, "relocated to Ba Sing Se," the air just left the room. "It was a tactical display of power, Avatar," Azula said, watching him carefully, maintaining her analytical distance. "It was harsh, but it was necessary to establish dominance. You proved they cannot push you." "No," Aang said, shaking his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "It wasn't tactical, Azula. I didn't plan it, I didn't think about the political ramifications, or neutrality, or balance. It was lethal." Azula went entirely still. "If you hadn't touched my arm," Aang confessed, his voice breaking, the shame and terror bleeding into the quiet room. "If you hadn't stopped me, I don't know what I would have done. I wanted to destroy them. I wanted to crush the air out of their lungs until they stopped moving, just for looking at him the wrong way. Just for thinking they could take him from us." Aang dropped his head back into his hands, his fingers digging violently into his scalp. "I felt it, the absolute, blinding need to burn everything down to keep him safe. It felt like falling into the dark." He looked back up at her, a tear escaping down his cheek, tracing the line of his blue arrow. "I understand him now, Azula. I understand your father." The words hit Azula with the force of a physical blow. She stared at the weeping Avatar. She was completely stripped of her assumptions. To hear the gentle, pacifist monk, the boy who had refused to kill Ozai even when the fate of the world demanded it, compare himself to the monster who had raised her crossed an invisible, monumental line in her mind. It was the ultimate vulnerability. He was offering her the darkest, most terrifying piece of his soul, a piece he had never shown to Katara, or Sokka, or the world. Azula stood up. She didn't think about the royal protocols. She didn't think about the power dynamics or the psychological warfare she had waged her entire life. She walked across the thick rugs, her heavy silk robes whispering against the stone. She stopped in front of Aang. And then, Princess Azula of the Fire Nation did the unthinkable. She sank down, folding her legs beneath her, and sat on the cold stone floor directly across from him. It was a massive, unprecedented concession of her royal pride, bringing herself entirely down to his level in the dirt. Aang looked up at her in shock, his breath hitching. "You are nothing like Ozai," Azula said. Her voice was quiet, completely lacking its usual venom or mocking lilt. She addressed him with an absolute, piercing sincerity that demanded he listen. "My father," Azula continued, her golden eyes burning into his gray ones, "did not try to burn the world down to protect us, Aang. He burned us to protect himself. He viewed Zuko and me as extensions of his own ego, as tools to secure his legacy. He didn't love us, he loved the power we represented." Aang stared at her, absorbing the raw, unfiltered truth of her trauma. "You," Azula said, leaning forward slightly, the space between them suddenly thick with a terrifying, undeniable mutual understanding. "You wanted to destroy them today to protect your son. You wanted to rip the air from their lungs because they threatened an innocent child. That is not tyranny. That is fatherhood. It's dangerous," Aang whispered, his voice trembling. "It goes against everything the monks taught me. An avatar is supposed to be detached. We are supposed to love the world equally. But I don't. I love him more. If it came down to Zahn or the world, I would let the world burn. I'm terrified of what that makes me." "Then let it be terrifying," Azula said fiercely, her eyes locking onto his. "Let it be dark. Do you think the world respects a peaceful monk when they want what he has? They don't. They respect power. They respect the monster in the dark." She didn't reach out to touch him. The physical boundary remained intact, but the emotional wall between them had been utterly, irrevocably demolished. "Let them be afraid of you," Azula whispered, her words a dark, profound blessing in the shadows of the caldera. "Let Kui tremble in his earth palaces. Let the north freeze in their terror. If they believe you are capable of suffocating them where they sit, they will never, ever try to take him from us. Your darkness will keep him safe. Aang looked at the princess of the Fire Nation, the woman who had once been his greatest nightmare, and saw the only person in the world who truly understood the terrifying weight in his chest. He didn't pull away from the ruthlessness she offered, instead, he nodded, a silent, unbreakable vow sealing itself between them in the quiet shadows of the caldera. For the first time since the heavy bronze doors of the palace had locked them inside together, the suffocating isolation didn't feel like a prison. Sitting on the cold stone floor, guarding their sleeping son, they had finally become a true partnership, two lethal forces of nature, completely. The morning after the global summit, a profound, ringing silence fell over the Caldera Palace. From the high balcony of their private wing, Aang and Azula had stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the massive, rigid Earth Kingdom dirigibles detach from their mooring masts and the Northern Water Tribe ships break the waters of the harbor. They watched until the vessels were nothing more than specks against the horizon, retreating to their respective corners of the world. The dignitaries had fled. The rumor of the Avatar nearly suffocating the Earth King had spread through the palace corridors like wildfire, and from there, it had flown across the seas. The world no longer saw Aang as a helpless, tragic hostage of the Dragon Dynasty. They saw a terrifying, fiercely protective patriarch who had legally bound his absolute power to the most dangerous woman on the planet. Kuei didn't even look back, Aang had murmured, watching the last dirigible vanish into the clouds. They think I've been corrupted. Let them, Azula had replied, a dark, deeply satisfied smirk playing on her lips. A corrupted avatar is far more useful to us than a peaceful one. The world will leave our son alone now. Now, hours later, the absolute safety of their locked private wing felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. The political theater was over. It was time to deal with the true, unyielding sovereign of the caldera, a hungry 6-month-old. Aang sat cross-legged on the thick rug in the center of the room. A large, ornate porcelain bowl rested on the floor beside his knee, filled with a vibrant, bright orange puree of mashed fire peaches. Zan was securely wedged in the bowl of Aang's lap, wearing nothing but a light linen diaper due to the stifling mid-morning heat. All right, Zan, here comes the sky bison, Aang announced, his voice dipping into an exaggerated, theatrical whisper. He scooped a healthy dollop of the orange puree onto a small wooden spoon. Aang raised the spoon into the air, making it swoop and dive in wide, looping arcs. He pursed his lips, making incredibly realistic, whistling wind noises, mimicking the sound of a glider cutting through the clouds. Whoosh, incoming. Zan, however, was fundamentally unimpressed by the aerodynamics of his breakfast. The baby's wide gray eyes were locked onto the spoon, not with hunger, but with the intense, chaotic curiosity of a 6-month-old who had recently discovered he had hands. As Aang brought the spoon in for a landing, Zan didn't open his mouth. Instead, with a sudden, jerky burst of uncoordinated speed, Zan swung his right arm up. His chubby fist collided squarely with the spoon. The impact sent a glob of fire peach puree flying through the air, splattering wetly against the heavy velvet drapes. Whoa, hey, Aang laughed, pulling the spoon back. That's a foul. The sky bison is supposed to land in the cave, not crash into the mountain. Zan babbled loudly, a string of forceful, consonant-heavy sounds that sounded distinctly like a tiny, demanding argument. He lunged forward, his hand slapping down directly into the porcelain bowl. Thick orange puree squelched between his fingers. He pulled his hands up, staring at his messy fists in absolute wonder, before letting out a delighted shriek. No, no, we eat the peaches, we don't wear them, Aang chuckled, gently trying to pry Zan's sticky hands away from his face. But as Zan inhaled sharply to let out another giggle, a speck of the acidic peach juice found its way into his nose. Zan's little face scrunched up, his eyes squeezed shut, his mouth opened wide in a perfect, silent, oh. Aang recognized the buildup instantly. Oh, Zan sneezed. It wasn't a normal baby sneeze. It was a concentrated, explosive burst of airbending that erupted from the infant's lungs. The force of the wind hit the porcelain bowl perfectly. Splat, Aang froze. The room was utterly silent, save for the soft, bubbling sound of Zan happily sucking on his own puree-coated thumb. Aang sat perfectly still. His saffron robes were splattered. His face was coated, and his freshly shaved, entirely bald head was completely plastered in bright orange fire peach mush, completely obscuring the blue arrow tattoo beneath a layer of sticky fruit. A large glob of puree dripped slowly from the tip of his nose, landing with a quiet plop onto Zahn's knee. Sitting at her ornate mahogany desk across the room, reviewing a ledger, Azula paused. She lowered the scroll slowly, her golden eyes drifting over to the scene on the rug. For a long moment, she simply stared at the most powerful being on the planet, dripping in baby food. She didn't gasp. She didn't offer a towel. She set her scroll down, pushed her chair back, and stood up. She walked across the room, her posture impeccably straight, until she stood towering over the monk and the baby. Aang blinked, a piece of peach falling from his eyelash. "Well," he said, his voice entirely deadpan. "That's one way to eat breakfast." Azula ignored him entirely. She looked dead into Zahn's wide, luminous gray eyes. She did not soften her voice. She addressed the giggling, sticky 6-month-old with the lethal, uncompromising seriousness of a military commander addressing a rogue, insubordinate lieutenant. "Prince Zahn," Azula said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a sharp, commanding resonance that echoed off the stone walls. Zahn immediately stopped sucking his thumb. He looked up at his mother, completely captivated by the sudden, commanding tone. "That is an unacceptable waste of palace rations," Azula continued, her face a mask of terrifying authority. "Furthermore, friendly fire on your commanding officer is a court-martial offense. You will swallow your sustenance, or you will be subjected to the mashed lychee nuts, which I know you despise." Zahn stared at her, the baby's brow furrowed, processing the absolute, unyielding energy rolling off of her. For 5 long seconds, it was a standoff between the princess of the Fire Nation and a 20-pound infant. Then, Zahn let out a soft, compliant little coo. He opened his mouth wide, exactly like a little bird waiting for a worm, staring expectantly at the spoon in Aang's hand. Aang burst into uncontrollable laughter. He laughed so hard his shoulders shook, reaching up to blindly wipe the peach puree from his eyes. "I can't believe that worked," Aang wheezed, scooping up the remaining puree and smoothly depositing it into Zahn's waiting mouth. "You just intimidated a baby into eating his breakfast." Azula crossed her arms, her golden eyes flashing with a terrifying, entirely unironic pride. "I do not negotiate with terrorists, Avatar. Even the small, sticky ones. Finish feeding him before he launches another offensive." She turned on her heel and walked back to her desk, though Aang didn't miss the subtle, unmistakable twitch at the corner of her mouth that looked dangerously close to a smile. By midday, the heat in the caldera had grown stifling, pressing against the high glass windows of the private wing. Aang and Azula had abandoned their formal attire for light, breathable indoor robes. They were lounging on the massive, golden-threaded rug in the center of the room, seeking whatever coolness they could find from the stone floor beneath it. Zahn, however, possessed the boundless, terrifying energy unique to an overtired infant who refused to nap. The 6-month-old was full of restless, squirming vitality. He rolled from his back to his stomach, pushed himself up on his shaky arms, and let out a series of loud, frustrated grunts. He wanted to crawl, but his body hadn't quite figured out the mechanics yet, leaving him stranded and highly agitated. "All right, little windstorm, we need to burn some of this off," Aang murmured. He sat up, stretching his legs out. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on a finely carved, wooden turtle duck toy resting near the bassinet. Aang summoned the toy to his hand with a quick flick of his wrist. He looked down at Zahn, who was currently trying to chew on the fringe of the rug. "Hey, Zahn, look here." Zahn looked up, spitting out a golden thread. Aang held his palm flat. He generated a tiny, hyper-focused sphere of compressed air, spinning it rapidly. He gently placed the wooden turtle duck on top of the airball. The toy hovered smoothly, spinning slightly, suspended 3 inches above the floor. Zahn gasped. His gray eyes went wide, absolute wonder washing over his little face. "It's a game," Aang explained, his voice bright. "It's called Catch the Turtle Duck." Aang pushed the airball forward, hovering it just an inch out of Zahn's reach. Zahn immediately lunged, swiping his chubby hand through the air, but Aang smoothly pulled the toy back at the last second. Zahn let out a sharp, indignant squeak, his legs kicking furiously. "Too slow," Aang laughed, making the toy zip to the left, then to the right. Zahn was entirely consumed by the challenge. He swiped, he grabbed, he rolled onto his side to try and trap it, but Aang was always a fraction of a second faster, reading the baby's uncoordinated movements with ease. But after 10 minutes, the wonder faded into genuine frustration. Zahn's lower lip pushed out, trembling violently. He let out a loud, angry wail, slamming both hands down on the rug in defeat. "Oh, I think I made it too hard," Aang grimaced, the hovering toy dropping to the floor. Aang looked across the rug. Azula was reclining on a velvet floor cushion a few feet away. She held a heavy scroll in her hands, ostensibly reading about naval supply lines, but Aang could see her golden eyes flicking over the top of the parchment, tracking the toy's movements. Aang picked up the turtle duck and smiled, a mischievous, daring glint in his gray eyes. "You know, Zahn, I think we need backup. Your mother thinks she's a tactical genius. Let's see if she can catch a turtle duck." Without warning, Aang generated a stronger current of air, sending the wooden toy hovering rapidly straight toward Azula's face. Azula didn't flinch, she didn't drop her scroll. Without looking away from Aang, her right hand snapped up with lightning speed, snatching the wooden toy out of the air a mere inch from her nose. Zahn stopped crying instantly, staring at his mother with absolute awe. Azula slowly lowered her scroll. She looked at the wooden toy in her hand, then looked at the avatar. Her expression was dangerous, but there was a sharp, competitive spark igniting in her eyes. "You are utilizing chaotic, erratic movement patterns to confuse an opponent who lacks depth perception, Avatar," Azula stated clinically. "It is a flawed strategy. You do not outrun the opponent, you predict where they will be." Aang grinned. "Show me, princess." Azula set her scroll down. She shifted off her cushion, moving closer to the center of the rug, forming a triangle with Aang and the baby. She tossed the turtle duck back to Aang. "Levitate it, keep the speed inconsistent." Aang obliged, spinning the airball and sending the toy hovering between the three of them. "Now, Prince Zahn," Azula said, her voice commanding the baby's total attention. "Retrieve the target." Zahn lunged. Aang immediately pulled the toy upward to dodge. But Azula didn't use bending. She didn't need to. She possessed a terrifying, unparalleled tactical anticipation. She watched the twitch of Zahn's shoulder, calculated the trajectory of Aang's evasion, and reached her hand out not to where the toy was, but to the exact empty space of air where it was going to be. Smack! The toy landed perfectly in her palm right before Zahn's fingers closed on empty air. Zahn gasped, looking from his empty hands to his mother. Azula smirked, a genuine, fiercely proud expression, and tossed the toy back to Aang. It quickly evolved into a mesmerizing, high-speed, three-person rhythm. Aang provided the levitation, sending the toy zipping, diving, and swooping in chaotic, unpredictable loops. Azula provided the flawless, predictive intercepts, snatching the toy out of the air right as Zahn moved to strike, acting as an impenetrable goalie. And Zahn sat in the middle of it all, shrieking with absolute, unadulterated joy as he tried to outsmart his terrifyingly competent parents. "He's favoring his left side," Azula called out over the baby's laughter, snatching the toy again. "His right arm lags by half a second. Exploit the blind spot. He's a baby, Azula, not an Earth Kingdom battalion." Aang laughed, catching her pass and sending the toy into a wide arc. "Excuses breed weakness, Avatar. Keep the elevation low." For 20 minutes, the heavy tension of the caldera vanished entirely. They operated not as forced political prisoners, but as a perfectly synchronized, joyful unit. Aang laughed until his sides ached, and Azula's competitive fire burned bright and clear, stripped of its usual malice. And Zahn, exhausted by the thrill of the hunt, finally caught the toy when Azula deliberately slowed her hand by a fraction of a second. The baby pulled the wooden turtle duck to his chest, letting out a victorious, crowing laugh, before promptly falling backward onto the rug, completely wiped out. Aang laid back on the rug as well, staring up at the painted ceiling, catching his breath. He turned his head, looking at Azula. She was slightly flushed, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, a rare, genuine spark of amusement still lingering in her eyes. "Not bad, princess," Aang breathed. Azula met his gaze. The air between them felt different. Lighter. "Your evasion tactics are predictable, monk. But it was an adequate exercise." By evening, the consequences of the puree disaster and the intense rug game had caught up with them. Zahn was sticky, sweaty, coated in fine dust from the rug, and smelling distinctly of fermented peaches. It was time for a bath. Aang gathered the sleepy baby into his arms and walked toward the opulent, marble-tiled royal washroom attached to their wing. It was a massive, echoing chamber of dark polished stone, smelling faintly of jasmine and steam. Azula followed him in, carrying a stack of pristine white linen towels. This was a profound, unspoken threshold they were crossing. For the first 5 months of Zahn's life, Azula had bathed him entirely alone. It had been a terrifying, paranoid necessity in the locked tower. Boiling water over small, controlled flames, terrified a servant would hear the splashing. Even after the wedding, out of sheer habit and a lingering, desperate need for control, she had handled the bathing routine herself while Aang stayed in the bedchamber. But tonight, she didn't stop him at the door. She didn't demand the child. She let him carry Zan inside. Aang approached the small, gilded copper basin set into the center of the marble floor, specifically designed for infants. He turned the heavy brass tap, letting the water rush in. "How full?" Aang asked softly, deferring to her expertise, painfully aware that she had 1,000 hours of experience he lacked. "Just past the second etching on the copper," Azula instructed, stepping up beside him. Aang shut off the tap. He dipped his hand in. It was cold, drawn straight from the caldera's deep cisterns. He pulled his hand back, preparing to ask a servant to bring up boiling water from the kitchens. But Azula didn't call for a servant. She set the towels down on a marble bench. With swift, practiced movements, she rolled up the heavy, wide silk sleeves of her indoor robe, pinning them tightly above her elbows, revealing her pale, bare arms. She knelt gracefully by the edge of the copper tub. She plunged her right hand deep into the cold water. Her brow furrowed in intense, absolute concentration. She didn't summon a roaring flame or a crackling bolt of lightning. Instead, she released a tiny, microscopic, sustained pulse of pure thermal energy directly into the water. Aang watched, utterly fascinated, as the water around her wrist began to shimmer with heat. Thin wisps of steam rose from the surface. In less than 10 seconds, Azula withdrew her hand. "Test it," she commanded. Aang dipped his fingers in. It was incredible. The water wasn't just warm, it was the exact, mathematically perfect body temperature. It was a display of elemental control so fine, so delicate, it made her explosive lightning look blunt by comparison. "That's amazing," Aang breathed, looking at her with genuine awe. Azula looked away, picking up a bar of unscented soap. "It is basic thermal regulation. Do not gawk, Avatar, the water will cool. Put him in." Aang carefully lowered Zan into the copper tub. The moment the baby's skin hit the warm water, Zan let out a happy, relaxed sigh. But the relaxation lasted exactly 3 seconds. The moment Zan realized he was submerged, his instincts from the afternoon game took over. Zan brought both of his chubby hands down hard, slapping the surface of the water with all his 6-month-old strength. Splash! Water flew everywhere, soaking the front of Aang's robes and dampening the marble floor. "Hey, we're bathing, not swimming in a typhoon," Aang laughed, shielding his face. Zan slapped the water again, giggling wildly at the sound. Aang decided to lean into the chaos. He picked up the bar of soap, lathering it vigorously between his hands until he had a thick mound of suds. He held his soapy hands up, pursed his lips, and blew a precise, twisting current of air through his fingers. A massive, swirling cloud of iridescent soap bubbles erupted into the room, floating gently over the copper tub. Zan gasped, his eyes going wide as saucers. He stopped slapping the water and reached up, his wet hands grasping frantically at the floating, shimmering orbs. Every time he caught one, it popped with a tiny snap, making him blink in confusion before laughing and reaching for another. "You see, bubbles are much better than splashing," Aang said smugly, blowing another stream. Zan tracked a particularly large bubble as it drifted lazily toward the edge of the tub, right where Azula was kneeling with a washcloth. Zan lunged for it. He missed the bubble entirely. Instead, both of his hands came crashing down into the water with explosive force, right at the edge of the basin. A massive, tidal wave of soapy, warm water launched up and over the copper lip. It hit Azula squarely in the chest, rushing up her neck, and splashing directly into her face. Aang froze. The air left his lungs. He stopped blowing bubbles. The remaining suds drifted to the floor and popped in the deafening, terrifying silence. Aang stared at the princess of the Fire Nation. Her heavy silk robe was plastered to her chest, dark with water. Drops of soapy water clung to her eyelashes, dripping slowly down the sharp, aristocratic line of her nose. Her dark hair, loosened from the afternoon, was plastered wetly against her cheek. Aang braced himself for an explosion. He expected her to stand up, her golden eyes flashing with lethal fury. He expected her to storm out of the washroom, demanding the palace guards execute whoever made the soap. He expected absolute hellfire. Azula did not move. She slowly blinked the soapy water out of her eyes. She looked down. Zan was sitting in the tub, his hands resting on the surface. The baby was looking up at his mother's wet, dripping face, and letting out a loud, uncontrollable, highly amused giggle. Azula stared at the laughing baby. Then, the corners of her mouth twitched. "A tactical strike, Prince Zahn," Azula said, her voice dangerously soft, laced with a velvet purr. "A bold maneuver, but you left your flank exposed." With a swift, fluid, entirely unroyal flick of her wrist, Azula scooped a handful of water from the tub and splashed it in a perfect, targeted arc right onto Zahn's tummy. Zahn gasped in shock as the water hit him. He blinked, stunned for a second, before throwing his head back and laughing even harder, slapping the water to retaliate. Aang stared at her, his heart swelling so fast and so violently it physically ached against his ribs. She was soaking wet. Her armor, both physical and psychological, was completely gone. She was sitting on a hard marble floor, engaging in a splashing war with a 6-month-old. In that moment, stripped of the caldera's shadows and the weight of her father's legacy, she wasn't a monster. She was just a mother, fiercely, terrifyingly beautiful, playing with her son. Aang grabbed a washcloth and threw it lightly, hitting Azula's shoulder. "Hey, no unfair advantages. He doesn't have your reach." Azula turned her golden eyes on him, a wicked, genuine smile breaking across her face. "Then defend him, Avatar." The washroom devolved into absolute, soapy chaos. 2 hours later, the marble washroom was cleaned, and Zahn was finally, blessedly asleep. The baby lay in the center of the massive, silk-draped bed, entirely exhausted from the day's physical exertion. He was wearing a clean, soft white sleeping gown, his dark hair fluffy and smelling of jasmine soap. Aang was sitting cross-legged on the mattress right beside him. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a deep, settling peace. He gently stroked Zahn's forehead with his thumb, his eyes heavy with sleep. "Tell him a story," Azula's voice broke the quiet. Aang looked up. Azula was sitting at her vanity across the room. She had changed into a dry, loose crimson sleeping robe. She was brushing the tangles from her damp hair, looking at him through the reflection in the gilded mirror. "He's asleep, Azula," Aang whispered. "He won't hear it." "He will," she countered, her brush moving in slow, rhythmic strokes. "His subconscious is active. Furthermore, he is half-air nomad. If you intend to raise him with the knowledge of your people, you must begin before the fire sages fill his head with propaganda. Tell him a story." Aang looked at her, deeply moved by her insistence that he share his culture, a culture her nation had tried to erase. He looked back down at Zahn, a soft smile touching his lips. "All right," Aang murmured. He shifted his weight, getting comfortable. He didn't raise his voice, he spoke in a low, resonant, vibrating hum that filled the quiet bedchamber. "A long time ago," Aang began, his voice carrying the ancient cadence of the monks of the Southern Air Temple, "before the temples were built, before we learned to carve staffs or weave gliders, the first airbenders didn't know how to fly. They walked on the ground, just like everyone else. And they were afraid of the sky, because the sky was where the storms lived." At the vanity, Azula's brush slowed. She didn't turn around, but she closed her eyes, letting the steady, peaceful rhythm of his voice wash over her. It was entirely different from the militaristic histories and violent legends of conquest she had been raised on. "But there was one boy," Aang continued softly, tracing a circular pattern on Zahn's blanket. "His name was Legima, and Legima wasn't afraid of the storms. He used to climb to the highest peaks of the mountains, above the clouds, and he would watch the original benders. The sky bison." Legima realized that the bison didn't fight the wind. They didn't try to conquer the storms, or push the clouds out of their way. They just breathed. They let the wind flow through them, and they became a part of it. So, one day, a great storm rolled in. The winds were howling, pulling trees from the dirt. Everyone else hid in the caves. But Legima climbed to the peak. Aang's voice dropped to a whisper. He stood on the edge of the cliff. He closed his eyes. He didn't anchor himself to the rock. He let go of his fear, he let go of the ground, and he stepped off the edge. Azula's breath hitched slightly in the quiet room. The concept of letting go, of surrendering control, was terrifying to her. Yet, listening to him tell it, it sounded like absolute freedom. "And he didn't fall," Aang smiled, looking at Zahn's peaceful face. "The wind caught him." The sky bison saw that he understood, and they flew down to meet him. They taught him that true strength isn't about how hard you can hit the earth, it's about how lightly you can touch the sky. And that's how we learn to fly, little windstorm. By letting go. The story settled over the room like a warm, heavy blanket. Azula opened her eyes, staring at her own reflection. She felt an incredibly strange, tight ache in her chest. For the first time in her life, she wondered what it would feel like to just step off the edge and trust that the wind would catch her. A sharp, demanding series of knocks on the heavy oak doors of their private wing shattered the peace. Azula's spine went rigid, her hand instinctively dropping to her side where she kept a hidden dagger. Aang's head snapped up, his gray eyes flashing with instant annoyance. "Who is disturbing us at this hour?" Azula hissed, standing up. "I'll handle it," Aang said. His voice was no longer the soft, storytelling hum of a monk. It was flat, hard, and entirely devoid of patience. Aang stood up, his bare feet silent against the rugs. He walked across the vast bedchamber and pulled the heavy iron locking bar back. He pulled one of the massive oak doors open just a few inches, stepping into the gap to block any view of the room behind him. Standing in the hallway was Minister Qin, the same arrogant, ancient domestic minister who had insulted Zan at their wedding reception. He was flanked by two nervous-looking palace guards holding torches. Qin looked smug, entirely too comfortable for a man knocking on the Avatar's door at midnight. "Avatar," Qin bowed shallowly. "My apologies for the late intrusion. But with the foreign dignitaries departed, the domestic council requires immediate clarification." "Clarification on what, Minister?" Aang asked, his voice deadpan. "The princess issued a decree this afternoon," Qin said, his tone dripping with patronizing condescension, ordering a tripling of the harbor guard and demanding all incoming merchant vessels submit to a full structural search by the Imperial firebenders. "It is a paranoid measure. It will disrupt trade and anger the noble houses. We know you are a man of peace and reason, Avatar. We ask that you countermand your wife's excessive decree, to maintain harmony in the capital." Aang stared at the man. Qin was trying to drive a wedge. He was trying to appeal to Aang's pacifist nature to undermine Azula's authority, assuming the monk would easily fold to avoid conflict. Aang remembered the terror of the council chamber that morning. He remembered Azula standing in front of him, defending their family with lethal conviction. He remembered the advice she had given him in the dark: "Let them be afraid of you." Aang leaned casually against the heavy oak doorframe. His face and shoulders were still slightly damp from giving his son a bath. He looked entirely relaxed, but his gray eyes were dark and stormy. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. Aang simply lifted his right hand and snapped his fingers. A hyper-precise, invisible blade of wind shot down the corridor. It was so fast the guards didn't even have time to blink. Thwump. The flames on the guards' torches were instantly extinguished. But Aang didn't stop there. The wave of wind rolled down the length of the grand hallway, systematically snuffing out every single candle, brazier, and wall sconce in its path. Within a second, the entire corridor was plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. Minister Qin gasped in terror, stumbling backward. The guards drew their swords in a panic, the metal scraping loudly in the dark. Aang didn't move. He generated a tiny, glowing sphere of compressed air in the palm of his hand, just bright enough to illuminate his own face, casting sharp, menacing shadows upward over his blue arrow. "The princess and I speak with one voice, Minister," Aang said, his voice echoing coldly in the dark, pitch-perfect in its lethal calm. "Her decrees are my decrees. Her paranoia is my paranoia. If you ever attempt to circumvent her authority again, or if you ever question her security measures regarding my family, you will find out exactly how peaceful I am when provoked. Do you understand me?" "Why yes, Avatar," Qin stammered, terrified of the glowing figure in the dark. "Perfectly. Good. Have a good night, Minister," Aang said pleasantly. He stepped back and slammed the heavy oak door shut, dropping the locking bar with a definitive crash. Aang let out a long breath, releasing the glowing sphere of air. He turned around, leaning his back against the door. Azula was standing in the center of the room. She had watched the entire exchange through the crack in the door. The flickering light of the hearth fire danced across her features. Her lips were slightly parted, her golden eyes wide. She was deeply, profoundly impressed. She had expected him to argue with the man, or perhaps politely dismiss him. She had not expected him to plunge a hallway of armed guards into darkness and deliver a threat with such terrifying, effortless control. He hadn't lost his temper. He hadn't relied on the chaotic avatar state. He had used a calculated, ruthless display of power solely to protect her authority. It was undeniably, overwhelmingly attractive. Aang ran a hand over his bald head, looking suddenly self-conscious under her intense stare. "I know I'm supposed to be a diplomat," he muttered, walking back toward the center of the room. But that guy really gets on my nerves. It was executed flawlessly, Azula said, her voice slightly breathless. She didn't look away from him. You established absolute authority without drawing a single drop of blood. My father would have burned the man alive. You left him in the dark with his own terror. It was highly effective. Aang offered a small, tired smile. I had a good teacher. The adrenaline of the encounter slowly bled away, leaving the heavy, crushing exhaustion of the long day in its wake. Aang walked past the massive bed where Zan was sleeping. Out of sheer, ingrained habit over the past month, Aang walked toward the furthest corner of the room, near the cold stone hearth. He picked up the thick velvet floor cushion and began to arrange his thin, scratchy spare blanket over it. Azula watched him. The emotional wall between them had shattered the night before, during his confession about Ozai. The political wall had been demolished this morning in the council chamber. And just now, he had defended her absolute authority to her own ministers. She was done. She was entirely done watching the most powerful man in the world, the father of her child, sleep on a freezing floor like a penalized servant. She was no longer terrified of sharing the space. Leave the cushion, Aang, Azula commanded. Aang froze, the thin blanket clutched in his hands. He turned to look at her in the dim light. His gray eyes were cautious, instantly wary of overstepping. Azula, I don't want to crowd you, Aang said softly, his voice gentle. I promised I wouldn't push you. I'm fine on the floor. You are the Avatar, not a stray wolf bat, Azula said, her voice sharp, using her practical, commanding tone to violently mask the extreme vulnerability of what she was doing. The floor is unbecoming of your station. Furthermore, the stone is drawing the heat from the room. Aang didn't move. I really don't mind. Azula let out a sharp sigh of exasperation. She turned, walked to the massive, sprawling royal bed, and grabbed the heavy crimson silk sheets. With a decisive yank, she pulled the covers back, deliberately and explicitly leaving the entire left side of the mattress completely open. Zan was safely asleep in the absolute center, acting as a small, breathing boundary line. I am not offering out of charity, you idiot, Azula said, refusing to look at him, her cheeks suddenly feeling terribly warm. She climbed into the right side of the bed, pulling the silk up to her waist. You snore when your neck is at a bad angle on the stone, and the sound is disturbing my sleep. The mattress is large enough to accommodate a standing army. Get in the bed. Aang stared at the empty expanse of silk. He looked at her back, rigid and tense as she faced away from him. He understood perfectly what she was doing. She was offering a truce, wrapped in an insult, because she didn't know how to ask for companionship any other way. Aang dropped the thin blanket onto the floor. He walked slowly, silently across the room. He reached the edge of the bed and carefully climbed onto the mattress. The bed was incredibly soft, a massive contrast to the punishing stone he had endured for 30 days. Aang slid beneath the heavy silk covers on the far left side. The mattress was indeed massive. There were feet of space between him, Zan, and Azula. They did not touch. They were separated by a sea of silk and the sleeping body of their son. But as Aang settled his head onto the plush pillow, the physical distance between them finally collapsed. They were lying under the same covers, breathing the same quiet, jasmine-scented air. Good night, Azula, Aang whispered into the dark. Go to sleep, Avatar, she replied, her voice muffled by the pillows. Azula kept her back turned to him. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was sharing a bed with her former enemy, the boy who had brought down her dynasty. But as the silence stretched, and she heard the slow, steady, grounding rhythm of Aang's breathing behind her, her muscles finally began to relax. For the first time in her entire, violence-soaked life, Princess Azula closed her eyes in the dark, knowing with absolute, unshakable certainty that the person lying behind her was there to protect her back, rather than put a knife in it. She stepped off the cliff, and let the wind catch her. The stifling, oppressive humidity of the caldera summer finally broke, yielding to the crisp, golden winds of autumn. The leaves on the fire maples in the palace courtyards turned brilliant shades of amber and scarlet, falling like dying embers against the dark obsidian stone. Inside the private wing, however, the changing of the seasons was entirely secondary to a much more terrifying development. Zan, at 8 months old, had discovered mobility. He did not simply crawl. Crawling was for normal infants bound by gravity and friction. Zan, possessing a pair of lungs that belonged in the high altitudes of the Western Air Temple, had intuitively figured out how to harness his Kai. By pushing tiny, erratic bursts of compressed air from his chubby palms, the baby could propel himself across the thick carpets at alarming speeds, sliding over the silk threads like a puck on a polished ice rink. Left flank, he's going for the seating area, Aang called out, shifting his weight on his knees. Aang and Azula were currently sitting on the floor of the vast bedchamber, acting as a human barricade. Aang wiped a bead of sweat from his bare, freshly shaven scalp. He lunged forward, his saffron robes rustling, and barely managed to catch Zahn by the waist just as the baby attempted to air scoot directly under a heavy, sharp-edged mahogany table. Gotcha, Aang panted, hauling the giggling, squirming infant back into the center of their circle. Zahn let out a loud, frustrated babble, his legs kicking wildly. As Aang held him, he noticed that the hem of Zahn's silken trousers had ridden up to his shins, and the sleeves of his little crimson tunic barely reached past his elbows. The baby had hit a massive, sudden growth spurt over the past 2 weeks. His wrists and ankles were completely exposed, the fine Fire Nation silk straining tightly across his broad little shoulders. Azula, sitting cross-legged a few feet away, held her hand out. Aang passed the wriggling child over to her. Azula did not bounce him. She did not coo. She held the squirming infant firmly at eye level, her golden eyes locking onto his wide, rebellious gray ones. She addressed him with the absolute, uncompromising seriousness of a Fire Lord addressing a rogue general. Prince Zahn, Azula commanded, her voice dropping into a sharp, authoritative register. Unsanctioned perimeter breaches are unacceptable. You lack the tactical awareness to navigate the table legs without sustaining a concussion. Desist immediately, or you will be confined to the bassinet. Zahn stared at her intense, beautiful face. He blinked once. Then, he blew a massive, wet raspberry, sending a spray of saliva into the air, and kicked his legs happily. Aang burst out laughing, leaning back on his hands. I don't think he respects your chain of command, princess. Azula sighed, a delicate, long-suffering sound, and shifted Zahn to sit securely on her lap. She brushed a stray piece of dark hair out of the baby's eyes. He is insubordinate, and he is growing too fast. The royal tailors are entirely incompetent. I requested new garments 3 days ago. Well, maybe the tailors wouldn't be so slow if they weren't terrified of making a mistake and facing your wrath, Aang teased gently. He looked at Zahn's tight clothes. You know, we don't have to wait for the silks. I could sew him some air nomad tunics. They're loose, they breathe better, and they don't restrict movement. He's an 8-month-old airbender, Azula. He needs to move. Silk is just going to restrict his kai. Azula shot him a withering glare. I will not have the heir to the dragon throne crawling around the palace looking like a runaway flying lemur, monk. Flying lemurs are very aerodynamic. Aang defended, grinning. And besides, yellow is definitely his color. It brings out his eyes. Crimson and gold, Avatar, Azula countered smoothly, though there was no real venom in her tone. It was the easy, familiar cadence of domestic bickering they had fallen into over the last 2 months. He is a prince of this nation. Though, I suppose I can concede to a lighter linen. If only to stop him from sweating on my robes during his unsanctioned military exercises. Aang smiled softly, the banter fading into a comfortable quiet. He watched her from his spot on the rug. Azula was gently rolling up the tight sleeves of Zahn's tunic so they wouldn't pinch his arms, her long, elegant fingers moving with surprising care. Zahn grabbed her thumb, babbling a string of nonsense vowels, and Azula actually hummed a low, acknowledging sound back to him. Aang felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of affection crash over his chest, so heavy it physically stole his breath. He looked at this woman. He saw the sharp, lethal princess of the Fire Nation, the tactician who had brought the Earth Kingdom to its knees. But superimposed over that image was the reality of the present. She was the woman who had locked herself in a stone tower, enduring agony and terror in the dark, just to bring this child into the world safely. She brought them back, Aang thought, the realization hitting him anew, vibrating through his very soul. She gave me back my people. Zahn was the first airbender born since the genocide. The first spark of life in a culture that the Fire Nation had spent a century trying to erase. And he had been born from the royal line of the very family that had started the fires. It was a cosmic, beautiful, terrifying poetry. With every passing day, as Aang watched Azula fiercely guard their son, the ice of their past melted further, replaced by a deep, undeniable reverence. She had given him the greatest gift the universe could bestow, and he was hopelessly, utterly devoted to her for it. The quiet peace of the morning was shattered an hour later when the heavy oak doors of the private wing unsealed. Zuko strode into the sitting room, his crimson robes billowing behind him. The political honeymoon period following the global summit had officially ended, and the caldera was returning to its natural state of cutthroat paranoia. The young Fire Lord looked like he had barely slept. "The High Sages are pushing," Zuko announced without preamble, collapsing into a plush armchair and rubbing his scarred eye. Azula, who had been reading at her desk, closed her ledger with a sharp snap. Aang, who was currently letting Zahn chew on the wooden beads of his necklace, looked up. "Pushing for what?" Aang asked. "Everyone knows he's an airbender now. The whole world knows. What more do they want?" "That is exactly the problem," Zuko grimaced. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because his element is public knowledge, the traditionalists are furious. The head priest is demanding that Zahn undergo the rite of the Ember." Azula went absolutely still. "No, what's the rite of the Ember?" Aang asked, looking between the siblings, his protective instincts instantly flaring. "It is an archaic, barbaric blessing," Azula stated, her voice turning to ice. She stood up, pacing the room. "The infant is placed in the center of the sun ring, a circle of sacred fire. A firebending child instinctively draws the heat away or resonates with it. An airbender will panic," Zuko finished grimly. "If Zahn blows the fire out, it's considered sacrilege against Agni. If he doesn't, he could be burned. The sages know this. They are trying to force a cultural crisis. If we refuse the rite, they will declare to the noble houses that Zahn is unfit to be the heir to the dragon throne because he cannot withstand the flames. If we accept, they endanger his life. They are trying to delegitimize him," Azula snarled, her golden eyes flashing. "They want to prove my son is an outsider." Zuko sighed heavily. He looked up, watching Aang bounce the baby. The heavy, stressed lines on the Fire Lord's face softened slightly as Zahn let out a happy coo. Zuko held his hands out, and Aang passed the baby over. Zuko situated his nephew on his knee, letting the child grab at the heavy gold insignia on his chest. "We need a delay tactic while I dismantle the head priest's legal standing," Zuko said, looking from Zahn to his sister. He paused, his golden eyes narrowing slightly as he took in Azula's appearance. "What?" Azula demanded defensively, catching his stare. "You look rested," Zuko observed, genuine confusion lacing his tone. "I mean, you have a baby, so you look tired, but the bags under your eyes are gone. You haven't looked this rested since before the war ended." Azula stiffened, her chin lifted into a sharp, aristocratic angle. "I have access to better tea now, Zuko. Do not read into it." Zuko smirked, a knowing, brotherly expression. He looked around the suite of rooms. Knowing the political, forced nature of their marriage, Zuko naturally assumed Aang slept in one of the adjoining sitting rooms or private studies within the wing, giving his volatile sister a wide, respectful berth. "Well, whatever it is, I'm glad," Zuko said. He looked at Aang. "I've ordered the inner wing guards to keep their distance from the outer sitting rooms at night, Aang. I know the stone floors in the antechamber are uncomfortable enough without armored sentries marching past your cushion every hour." Silence descended on the room. Aang and Azula did not move. Across the space, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. It was a brief, incredibly loaded look. For 2 months, Aang had not slept on a cushion in the antechamber. For 2 months, they had been sleeping in the exact same, massive royal bed in the main chamber. It hadn't been romantic. It was born of sheer, practical exhaustion. When an 8-month-old was teething or going through a sleep regression, getting out of a warm bed to walk across a freezing stone floor multiple times a night was torture. So, Aang stayed in the bed. They woke up 3 or 4 times a night to soothe Zahn. Often, they would collapse back into the mattress in a state of absolute, blinding exhaustion, too tired to enforce the rigid physical boundary they had established. There had been mornings where Aang woke up to find his leg tangled in the silk with hers, or mornings where Azula woke up to find she had unconsciously gravitated toward the radiating heat of the Avatar's chest. Whenever it happened, they woke up, immediately shifted to opposite sides of the mattress, and fiercely, silently pretended not to notice. It was an unspoken, terrifying truce. Neither of them corrected Zuko. "Focus on the sages, Zuko," Azula deflected sharply, turning her back to him to adjust a vase on a side table. "The Avatar's sleeping arrangements are irrelevant to state security." Stall the head priest. "If he tries to place my son in a ring of fire, I will remove his hands at the wrist." The following afternoon, the heavy, oppressive tension of Fire Nation politics was temporarily shattered by a hurricane of familiar faces. The gong had arrived for a heavily vetted, officially sanctioned, diplomatic, visit. They were ushered into the private lounge of the royal wing. It was the first time they had seen Aang and Azula in 2 months. Katara practically sprinted across the room, pulling Aang into a fierce hug before immediately demanding to hold the baby. Sokka trailed behind her, carrying a massive, suspiciously heavy bag of gifts. Toph casually leaned against the doorway, looking at the room with her feet. "Oh, look how big you've gotten," Katara cooed, bouncing Zahn, who stared at her water tribe hair loopies with intense fascination. "Aang, he is gorgeous. And heavy. We got him something," Sokka announced proudly, dropping the sack on a low table. He reached in and pulled out a massive, incredibly thick garment made of heavy blue wool and white animal pelts. Ta-da, traditional southern water tribe parka. For the winter. Azula, sitting elegantly on a velvet chaise lounge nearby, eyed the garment. She internally groaned at the thick, unrefined, barbaric pelts, but she maintained a polite, icy composure. She recognized the tactical utility of the heavy furs for the incoming cold season. "It is robust, Sokka. I am sure it will provide adequate thermal protection." Sokka blinked, looking at her as if she had grown a second head. "Did she just thank me?" "Aang, blink twice if you're under the influence of bloodbending." "She's just being polite, Sokka," Aang laughed, pouring tea for his friends. The gong settled into the lounge area. They had all come expecting the fake marriage to look strained. They expected Aang to look miserable and trapped, and they expected Azula to be barking orders or looming menacingly in the corners. Suddenly, Zahn, who had wriggled out of Katara's arms and was placed on the floor, decided to show off his new trick. With a loud, bubbly shriek, Zahn aimed his palms backward and blasted a burst of air. He shot across the rug like a torpedo, aiming directly for the low, dark wood table where Sokka had placed the gift bag. Zahn's momentum carried him right into one of the table legs. The impact wobbled the table violently. A heavy, priceless porcelain vase filled with water and fresh fire lilies tipped over the edge, plummeting directly toward the baby's head. Sokka shouted a warning. Katara reached for her water pouch. They were too slow, but Aang and Azula were not. Without exchanging a single word, a single look, or even a gasp, they moved. Aang casually, almost lazily, flicked his wrist from where he was pouring tea. A thick, invisible cushion of compressed air formed instantly beneath the falling vase, catching it silently 2 inches above the floor. Simultaneously, Azula, who hadn't even stood up from her chaise, leaned over gracefully. Her arm shot out, her hand snagging the back collar of Zahn's tunic, plucking the baby out of the air right as he bounced off the table leg, lifting him securely into her lap before he could even register the danger. The vase hovered. The baby was safe. The tea didn't spill. Katara and Sokka stared, their jaws hanging slightly open. The coordination was terrifying. It wasn't just fast, it was entirely, flawlessly synchronized. "Okay," Sokka said slowly, looking between the monk and the princess. "When exactly did you two become a synchronized, two-headed parenting monster?" Toph, who was smirking from her spot near the door, crossed her arms. "It's not just their reflexes, Snooples. Their heartbeats are perfectly in sync. They both spiked at the exact same millisecond, and leveled out at the exact same time. It's disgusting." Azula's head snapped toward the blind girl. Her pale cheeks flushed a faint, angry pink. "Do not monitor my internal organs, Bifong. It is incredibly invasive." Aang cleared his throat loudly, setting the teapot down, his own ears turning red. But as he looked at Azula, holding their son safely in her lap, he couldn't deny it. They were no longer two enemies playing house. They were a machine. By nighttime, the gong had retired to the luxurious guest wing on the other side of the palace. The adrenaline of the visit, combined with the lingering dread of the high sage's demands, left a heavy, exhausted quiet in the royal bedchamber. Zahn was fast asleep in his bassinet, tired out by the overwhelming attention of his aunts and uncles. Aang and Azula were sitting on the edge of their massive bed, preparing for sleep. Only a single, dim candle flickered on the nightstand. Azula was tense. Her right wrist was throbbing with a dull, persistent, burning ache. Carrying a heavy, squirming 8-month-old, combined with the constant, lightning-fast reflexes required to snatch him out of the air, had severely strained her tendons. She tried to hide a wince as she rotated her hand, rubbing her thumb hard into the joint to relieve the pressure. Aang noticed immediately. He turned on the mattress, shifting closer. "Let me help," Aang said softly. Azula pulled her arm away rigidly, her posture stiffening. I do not require your assistance, Avatar. It is merely a minor muscular strain. You let me help with Zahn, Aang pointed out, his voice gentle but entirely unyielding. Let me help you. He didn't wait for her permission. Moving slowly so she could pull away if she truly wanted to, Aang reached out. His large, warm hand closed gently around her forearm. Azula froze, but she didn't yank her arm back. Aang used his other hand to uncork a small, clay jar resting on the nightstand, a pot of cooling, medicinal herbal ointment Katara had brought from the South Pole. He scooped a small amount of the pale blue salve onto his fingertips. With agonizingly slow, deliberate care, Aang began to massage the ointment into the skin of her wrist. His thumbs moved in firm, small circular motions over her strained tendons, applying just enough pressure to relieve the ache without causing pain. Azula stared down at his hands. His touch was a devastating contradiction to everything she knew. She was a warrior. She was used to hands that gripped to hurt, to restrain, to fight. But his hands were incredibly warm, and they touched her with a reverence that made her chest physically ache. The quiet intimacy of the dark room, the rhythmic pressure on her skin, and the scent of the medicinal herbs triggered a memory she had spent over a year violently suppressing. She thought about Ba Sing Se. She thought about the dimly lit guest room in the upper ring. She remembered these exact same hands trailing across her jawline, down her neck. She got furiously angry at herself every time she remembered how safe she had felt that night, cursing her own weakness. She had convinced herself it was a manipulation, a fluke. But looking at Aang now, watching the incredibly patient, loving way he raised their son, the way he caught vases and defied ancient traditions just to protect her and Zahn, she could no longer deny the terrifying, bedrock sense of security he gave her. The dam broke. Why did you do it? Azula asked. Her voice was tight, scarcely more than a whisper, completely shattering the silence. She didn't look up at him, she kept her golden eyes fixed firmly on his hands massaging her wrist. Aang's hands stopped moving. He felt the sudden, electric shift in the air. He looked up, his gray eyes searching her face in the dim candlelight. Do what? Aang asked cautiously. In Ba Sing Se, Azula said, the words tasting like ash, but she forced them out. The vulnerability was suffocating. Why did you do it? You touched me like I was precious. Aang's breath hitched. They had never spoken about that night. Never. It was the ghost that haunted the space between them. I was your enemy, Azula continued, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed emotion, her eyes burning. I had hunted you across the world. I killed you in the catacombs. When you came to my room that night, you should have been rough. You should have taken your revenge. You should have treated me with the absolute contempt I deserved. But you didn't. Why were you so gentle? The air in the room became unimaginably thick, heavy with years of war, trauma, and unsaid truths. Aang looked at her. He saw the terrifying princess, but he also saw the deeply broken girl who had been taught that love was conditional upon perfection, and that touch was only ever a weapon. Aang shifted his grip. He didn't let go of her wrist. Instead, he slid his hand down, lacing his fingers gently through hers. Because I could never hate you, Azula, Aang whispered, his voice dropping to a heavy, emotional timbre that vibrated in the quiet room. Not then, and definitely not now. Azula's breath caught in her throat. She tried to pull her hand back, but he held on, not trapping her, just anchoring her. You spent your entire life being treated like a weapon, Aang said, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a devastating, heartbreaking honesty. Your father forged you in fire. He used you to fight his wars, and the second you broke, he threw you away in chains. Everyone in your life demanded a war from you. Aang swallowed hard, his thumb lightly stroking the back of her hand. I couldn't do it. I couldn't use you like he did. You were hurting that night. And I wanted you to know what it felt like to be held by someone who didn't want anything from you. Someone who wasn't demanding you to be a monster. A tear, hot and treacherous, slipped free from Azula's eye, tracking down her cheek. The profound, agonizing honesty of his words stripped away the very last, deepest layers of her armor. He hadn't touched her out of pity, or lust, or revenge. He had touched her out of pure, unconditional compassion. He had seen the broken, terrified girl beneath the blue fire, and he had chosen to comfort her. It was too much. The intensity of it was blinding. Azula finally pulled her hand free from his grip. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. Her throat was locked tight. She turned away from him, lying down on her side of the massive bed, pulling the silk sheet all the way up to her chin, retreating into the dark. Aang didn't push, he wiped the excess ointment from his hands and lay down behind her, leaving a respectful distance between them. The emotional exhaustion of the conversation pulled them both under. But hours later, in the deepest, coldest part of the night, when Zahn let out a soft cry in his sleep, they both stirred. Without waking fully, seeking the safety she had just been terrified by, Azula shifted backward. And Aang, operating on pure, protective instinct, reached out. When the sun began to rise over the caldera, illuminating the room in pale light, Aang's arm was draped heavily over Azula's waist, his hand resting securely against her stomach, her back pressed flush against his chest. When they woke, they untangled themselves quickly. They didn't speak of it. They fiercely pretended it meant nothing. But the silence between them was no longer cold, it was burning. The tension of the night carried over into the bright, crisp autumn morning. The adults were gathered in the private garden courtyard for breakfast. The gong was sitting at the stone table, digging into the Fire Nation delicacies. Aang was sitting at the head of the table, Zahn happily situated in his lap, gumming a piece of soft, steamed fire papaya. Azula sat to Aang's right, sipping her jasmine tea with her usual impeccable posture, though she steadfastly avoided meeting his eye. The peaceful breakfast, however, was being ruined by the Fire Lord. Zuko was pacing the length of the courtyard, his hands clasped behind his back, giving a very serious, very stressed speech regarding the High Sages. The head priest refuses to yield, Zuko ranted, his voice tight, his footsteps echoing sharply against the stone. He says if Zahn does not perform the rite of the ember by the new moon, the sages will petition the noble houses to formally contest his place in the line of succession. I need more time to find a legal precedent to block them, but... Azula rolled her eyes, setting her delicate teacup down with a sharp clink. Calm down, Zuzu, Azula drawled, her voice dripping with its trademark, mocking condescension. Your pacing is making me nauseous, and you are giving the baby anxiety. Sit down and eat your lychee nuts before your head explodes. Zuko stopped pacing, turning to glare at his sister. I am trying to prevent a constitutional crisis, Azula, excuse me for. Zuzu. The voice was high-pitched, loud, and incredibly clear. The entire courtyard froze. Zuko stopped mid-sentence. Katara dropped her spoon into her porridge. Sokka froze with a piece of smoked sea prune halfway to his mouth. Aang's jaw physically dropped open. Slowly, as one unified entity, every adult at the table turned their head to look at Aang's lap. Zahn, 8 months old and having never spoken a single, intelligible word in his entire life, was sitting up straight. The baby had a piece of mashed papaya smeared across his cheek. He was pointing a chubby, sticky finger directly at the paralyzed Fire Lord. Zahn looked at his uncle, his gray eyes bright, and flawlessly mimicked his mother's mocking, commanding tone. Zuzu, Zahn demanded again, kicking his little legs against Aang's thigh. For 3 seconds, absolute, stunned silence reigned over the courtyard. The sheer gravity of it being the heir to the Fire Nation's very first word collided spectacularly with the utter absurdity of what the word actually was. Sokka broke first. Sokka let out a sound that was half gasp, half snort. He slammed his hands down onto the stone table, threw his head back, and burst into hysterical, uncontrollable tears of laughter. Oh my spirits, Sokka wheezed, clutching his stomach. The heir to the dragon throne. His first word is Zuzu. I'm going to die. I'm actually going to die. Katara slapped her hands over her mouth, her shoulders shaking violently as she tried and failed to suppress her own laughter. Toph was cackling loudly, pounding her fist on the table. Zuko stood frozen on the stone path. His scarred face contorted through a rapid succession of emotions: absolute shock, deep, profound offense, and finally, a begrudging, amazed awe. Did my nephew just insult me? Aang looked from Zahn to the laughing Water Tribe siblings, utterly bewildered. Wait, was that it? Was that his first word? Zuzu. Aang turned his head to look at Azula. Azula was staring at the terrifying Fire Lord, who had just been named like a common turtle duck pet by her infant son. The stoic, porcelain mask of the princess completely shattered. Azula didn't just smirk. She didn't offer a polite, condescending chuckle. Azula threw her head back, her dark hair catching the morning sunlight, and she laughed. It was a full, genuine, bell-clear sound that echoed off the high walls of the courtyard. It wasn't the manic, terrifying cackle she had wielded during the war. It was bright, it was joyful, it was the sound of a young woman who was sitting with her family on a crisp autumn morning, completely and utterly happy. Aang didn't laugh with the rest of them. He was entirely, utterly mesmerized. He stared at Azula. He watched the way her golden eyes crinkled at the corners, the way the sunlight illuminated the pale column of her throat, the way the heavy, dark shadows of her past seemed to evaporate in the warmth of her own joy. The heavy political tension of the sages, the fear of the future, the ghosts of Ba Sing Se, it all dissolved entirely in the wake of that laugh. Aang looked at the woman beside him. The woman who had given him his son. The woman who fiercely guarded his back in the dark, and who had brought the airbenders back from the brink of extinction. Aang didn't put a specific name to the terrifying, overwhelming feeling expanding in his chest. He didn't formulate a romantic confession in his mind. But as Aang watched Azula laugh with his friends in the morning sun, his heart felt completely light.